No detail, just trust us. That's the upshot of the Prime Minister's pitch over the weekend. Vote to divide Australia by race, and if you do, a Labor Greens-dominated parliament will work out all the details. And if you don't like it, too bad. Once it's in the Constitution, it will likely never come out. My next guest is someone who's no stranger to Aboriginal issues, having shown a genuine commitment through his 25-year political career to the challenges of making a practical difference in the lives of Indigenous Australians. As Prime Minister, he brought the Aboriginal Affairs portfolio under direct control of the Prime Minister's department. As PM, he took government out of Canberra for a week every year and into a remote Aboriginal community to make sure his senior officials understood firsthand the challenges people faced. He established a special Indigenous Affairs Advisory Group, didn't need a constitution there, headed by Warren Mundine to cut through the bureaucracy and waste in this area. And his government created the cashless welfare card as he was sick of seeing taxpayer support go on grog and gambling rather than food on the table and clothes on the children's back. Joining me now from Sydney, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Well, welcome, Tony Abbott. I know this is an issue that's incredibly dear to your heart, even now that you've left formal politics, if I could say that. You're on the record as opposing a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice to the Parliament. Supporters say, well, we need one if we're ever going to overcome disadvantage. What do you say to that?
Peter, thanks for having me on the show and thanks for that wonderfully generous introduction. I think this proposed constitutionally entrenched voice to the Parliament, it's wrong in principle and it will work out badly in practice. I don't believe that we need a constitutional change if we are to have a voice, and certainly I don't think there's any lack of consultation already. There was ATSIC a few years back, which was ultimately abolished because it wasn't doing a good job. I certainly had an excellent Indigenous Advisory Council, as you've mentioned, headed up by Warren Mundine. There's no lack of consultation in this area. There are no lack of Indigenous voices in the Parliament right now. If anything, I think the problem is consultation paralysis when it comes to policy. And the biggest issue in Indigenous affairs is the fact that all too often we are unwilling to apply the same standards to Indigenous people and to expect the same responsibility of Indigenous people that's applied and expected more generally in the Australian community.
Jacinta Price says this will be another gravy train for the activists. She's very forthright in saying it won't affect the lives of remote communities. It won't deal with the issues on the ground, particularly for women and vulnerable children. Is she right?
I have enormous respect for Jacinta Price, and unlike so many of the people who talk a lot in this area, Jacinta Price has lived the life of remote Australia. She hasn't just studied it from afar. Jacinta's a Walpiri Celtic woman. She has an Anglo-Australian father and a Walpiri mother. She grew up in Yuendamu, one of the very remote settlements in the Northern Territory. She's been Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs and lived there, so she knows what she's talking about. And that's why her focus is so relentlessly practical. What are we actually going to do to get the kids to school, to get the adults to work, and to keep communities safe? Because all too often we apply these different standards and say, well, it's okay for Indigenous kids not to go to school. It's okay for Indigenous adults not to go to work because of culture. And we tolerate things that we wouldn't tolerate for a second in suburban Australia because we say, well, that's just the sort of thing that happens in remote places. Well, frankly, horrible things shouldn't happen anywhere, and crime is crime, regardless of where it's going on.
I'll come back to that point when I pick up the issue of this cashless welfare card that Labor want to abolish, but I want to pick up something in relation to the Liberal Party. You've been an opposition leader. The Liberal Party says it's got an open mind to the voice, that it's still waiting to see more detail. We're not going to get more detail. The Prime Minister made that clear over the weekend. But the philosophy that the Liberal Party was founded on rejects distinguishing human beings by race or any other characteristic. Now, surely that makes a new race-based body wrong in principle. You don't need the detail to tell you it's wrong.
I think that's a very fair point. Now, I've tried to make it my business since leaving Parliament, Peter, not to run a commentary on day-to-day political issues. I don't want to be in the business of telling my successors what they should do. But changing the Constitution is different. Changing the Constitution is for keeps in a way that legislative change or policy revision isn't. As I say, I just think that a race-based body in our Constitution is fundamentally wrong in principle, and it will work out badly in practice. And I just hope that my colleagues in Canberra are remembering that at heart, the Liberal Party is indeed liberal. It believes in the equal rights and dignity of every single person, regardless of colour, regardless of culture, regardless of gender. And this idea that people of a particular race should be given effectively 2 votes and should be represented twice in our national parliament, once in the normal parliament and again in this voice, I just think is alien to any proper understanding of liberal principles and indeed of conservative principles.
All right, let's go to your cashless welfare card that Labor wants to abolish. Why is this a bad idea? Well,
let's think of something else called the Basics card. Now, the Basics card was a slightly more bureaucratic version of the cashless debit card, and under the Basics card, up to 70% of a welfare recipient's income could be quarantined to the necessities of life, so almost as much as under the cashless debit card. The Basics card was introduced by the Howard government, but here's the point. It was improved and extended by Jenny Macklin when she was a minister in the Rudd-Gillard government. And in fact, when I was opposition leader, she asked for my support to make that happen, and I was very happy to do that. Now, my difficulty with what the government is proposing here is that how can the Basics card have been right under the Rudd-Gillard government, but the cashless debit card somehow be wrong under the Albanese government? And I guess the other point to make here is, well, they're making a big song and dance about this constitutionally entrenched voice, the Parliament, and yet the proposal to abolish the cashless debit card appears not to involve any consultation to speak of with the relevant community leaders on the ground, quite a few of whom, such as Ian Trust from the East Kimberleys, have been saying, sure, it's not perfect, but gee whiz, it's helped, and let's keep it.
Tony Abbott, clarity as always. Thank you for joining me tonight on Credlin.